Today we're not holding back, because we're diving into the boldest and most dangerous traps hidden inside my favorite bishop's opening. Get ready. It's time to unleash the attack. In most cases, your opponents are going to play knight to f6, which is the standard move attacking this pawn. As you defend it, they are going to play bishop to c5, which is very similar to the Italian game. That is how they usually play. Now, if you want to build up your attack slowly, you may first play pawn to d3 and later play pawn to f4, kind of mixing the bishop's opening together with the king's gambit or the Vienna gambit. However, if you want to be ultra-aggressive, then you play pawn to f4 straight away, directly challenging this pawn. If your opponent defends it passively, that is not a problem. You are simply going to continue developing your pieces and attacking. So the real question is, what if they accept this pawn gambit on f4? Because many of you write in the comments that at your level, everybody just captures that pawn. So what is going to happen after pawn takes f4? Well, you have two options. You can either push this pawn forward and chase away the knight, or you can push this pawn forward and chase away the bishop. I would say that if you are playing against lower-rated opponents, it is usually better to go for the first option, as they often do not know how to handle it. Look at this knight. It is under attack. Where can it go? It cannot move to the central squares, as you already control them. Similarly, it cannot go to the other side, as your queen controls those squares. Returning back to g8 is just very passive. Then, you play pawn to d4, kicking away the bishop. After that, you play bishop takes on f4, not bishop takes on f3, and you gain complete dominance here. Therefore, it is also bad for your opponent. Now, how about tricky players who respond with queen to e7? They want to capture your pawn, and your pawn is also pinned to your king, so you can no longer win their knight because the pawn is pinned. However, this is actually a step in a very wrong direction for them, because you play queen to e2, unpinning your pawn. Therefore, now the knight definitely needs to move. In general, you would wish to play pawn to d4 here, attacking the bishop. However, since your queen is no longer on d1, the move pawn to d4 is impossible, because black would simply capture the pawn. Instead, you prepare this move by playing knight to f3, getting ready for pawn to d4 on the next move. At the same time, you also control this important square so that black cannot ever go there and give you a check. Now your opponent feels uncomfortable. They would like to castle, but while they can develop their knight, it cannot move to certain squares because of your pawn structure. So what can they do? They play pawn to d6, desperately hoping you will trade pawns so that they can exchange queens, neutralize your attack, and reach an endgame with an extra pawn. But you spoil this plan by not trading pawns. Instead, you play knight to d5, threatening both the queen and the pawn on c7. The pawn on c7 is especially important, because from there you can also fork their king and rook. Therefore, black needs to keep their queen somewhere close so that it continues guarding the c7 pawn. But for us, it does not matter, because whether they move the queen here or there, we are going to sacrifice the knight on c7 and win the game with a fork. If black does not capture, we are at least winning the rook. But if they do capture, we have our little pawn marching forward, opening up with a discovered check, and on the next move we are going to capture their queen. Usually, this trap works like a charm. However, there is one subtle drawback. If your opponent is stronger, they may realize that against pawn to e5, the only move that keeps them in the game is a counterstrike with pawn to d5. Now everything is attacking everything, and the position becomes extremely messy. Nobody really understands what is going on. That is the downside. So if you are facing a stronger opponent, instead of pushing pawn to a5, it is often more effective to play pawn to d4. This is a more solid approach. You build up your center and kick away their bishop. The bishop needs to move, and usually it goes to b4, to a more active square where it pins your knight. Now the situation becomes a little shaky. It feels like you need a few more moves to complete your development. You want to bring out your other knight, recapture the pawn, and castle. Then you would have a great position. However, there is a problem. Because of the pin, they are threatening knight takes a4. Here comes a very elegant solution. By playing knight to e2, you are setting up a subtle and beautiful trap. This idea is so tricky that even masters, and probably even grandmasters, can fall into it. At this point, your opponent needs to do something. If they simply allow you to castle and then capture the pawn, you will have total dominance. A strong center, two very active bishops, and they to kick away their knights with pawn pushes. Everything is perfect. But what if they try knight takes a4, taking advantage of the pin? Well, you still calmly castle. Now the knight is free to move, which means black feels forced to trade. It is very hard to realize that this position is already lost for black. If the bishop moves, and that is what most opponents will do, either to d6 or to a7, it does not really matter. Wherever the bishop goes, there is a crushing move. bishop takes f7. This is the move your opponents will almost always overlook. It prevents them from castling and leaves their king exposed in the center. After that, knight takes f4 opens up a wave of threats. Most importantly, your rook is lined up directly against the king, and it is not easy for black to find safety. On top of that, the move queen to h5 comes into play, which is extremely dangerous and works in many variations. For example, if black captures your knight on f4, you do not even need to recapture. Queen to h5 is even stronger because the king has no safe escape. If the king tries to run, you have the subtle move queen to d5, forcing the king back onto the open file. Then rook takes f4 quickly wins the game within just a couple of moves. Some opponents may instead try rook to f8, hoping to complete an artificial castling. But even then, you are still a full piece ahead and completely winning the game. However, you do not let them get away so easily. You play knight to a6, sacrificing a knight. It is a discovered check, and at the same time you are attacking their queen. Therefore, if they wish to save the queen, they are forced to accept the sacrifice. But now the king is completely exposed. You can shut off its escape squares, whether it tries to run to the d-file or anywhere else. After the king moves either way, it is going to be checkmate. And with that, you are about to see one of the most counterattacking games in chess history. Black played knight to f6, the main line, but white refused to simply defend. Instead, white struck back in the center with pawn to d4. Now, if black captures this pawn, white can push the other pawn forward, creating dangerous threats. Often, black feels uncomfortable in this position. Believing the grass is greener on the other side, black instead jumped forward with knight to a4. White calmly recaptured, and suddenly this knight became nearly surrounded. From here, there are many possible threats against it. For example, if black plays bishop to c5 or knight to c6, white can respond with queen to d5, which creates multiple threats at once. In such cases, black can lose the game on the spot. However, in this game, black found a creative solution. Remember, both sides were counterattacking. Black played knight takes f2, forking both the queen and the rook. This is a very dangerous idea, and white needs to be extremely careful. If white carelessly captures the knight, that would be a blunder, because after queen to h4, black launches a devastating double attack. On top of that, white's king is exposed, white loses a pawn, and suddenly black would be the one winning the game. Instead of falling for this trap, white came up with a brilliant counter trick, queen to d5, setting up a threat of the classic scholar's mate. And if black simply defends, then the knight on f2 will fall, leaving white up a full piece. But black also came up with a counter trick to white's counter trick, queen to h4. This move does several things at once. First, it provides the king with an escape square. Second, it sets up the queen for potential discovered checks. And third, it keeps the rook on h1 under pressure. White is suddenly facing a tough position. What can be done? Instead of defending, white chose to attack with knight to f3. Now black faces the same challenge. If the queen simply moves, the knight on f2 will be lost. So black counterattacked once again with knight to d3. At this point, white cannot capture the queen, because that would allow a double check from the knight. Therefore, the king had to move. Now both the queen and the knight are hanging, so black played knight to f2 with check. This could have led to a funny perpetual check if white moved the king the wrong way. But instead, white carefully stepped to e2. Now the knight can no longer deliver checks. Black tried queen to e4 with check. The series of checks just kept going. I have rarely seen so many in a row. White responded with king takes f2, but then came bishop to c5 with yet another check. Instead of calmly developing pieces, both sides were locked in a wild, all-out attack. The white king moved again, and black brought the rook to f8, attacking the queen. The position was still not easy for white. If the queen moved, the bishop on c4 could drop, and the king remained exposed. But white once again refused to defend. Instead, he played bishop to g5 with check, striking back. And after that, he finished it off with bishop takes e7. Thanks for watching.